Good afternoon. My name is Michael Rich. I'm a faculty member in the Political Science Department, and I direct Emory's Office of University Community Partnerships, and I'm going to be speaking on the urban perspective. Barack Obama is probably the quintessential urban president. He's probably the first genuine big city president we've had in more than a century. You have to go back to the days of Grover Cleveland, who was a mayor of Buffalo, New York, Theodore Roosevelt, who was a police commissioner in New York City, or William Howard Taft, who was a county prosecutor in Cincinnati, to find a president who had urban experience. Obama's roots are very deep. He basically has spent his adult working life on the south side of Chicago, both as a community organizer, try that for a president, as a state legislator, and then as a senator. He understands urban issues probably far more deeply than any other president, or for that matter, just about any other person serving in Washington. And he, you could argue, came to office on an urban mandate. 45% of the small town vote and rural community vote went for him, 50% of the suburban vote, 59% in small cities, and a whopping 71% in big cities. And while these numbers match reasonably well with the traditional Democratic split of the vote, I think you could argue that these numbers and these margins are much higher than what they have been in the recent past. What I want to do in my remarks is talk a little bit about what Obama promised to do if he was elected, by looking at kind of the rhetoric and the positions he took on the campaign, and then compare them with what he's actually been able to accomplish during his first 2 years, and then offer some observations on what the likely scenario is going to be in the second half of his term. He came to the issues around cities and urban problems from a much different perspective than previous presidents, or for that matter, previous people campaigning for president. Early on in the campaign, he told a gathering of big city mayors that we need to stop seeing our cities as the problem and start seeing them as the solution, because strong cities are the building blocks of strong regions, and strong regions are essential for a strong America. Contrast that with some of the rhetoric we heard from Reagan, where not necessarily talking about cities, but government was the problem. His campaign had two major white papers, one entitled Supporting Urban Prosperity, the other Fighting Poverty and Creating a Bridge to the Middle Class, which both spoke to important urban issues. He gave a major campaign speech on changing the odds for urban America that was delivered in the Anacostia section of Washington, D.C., which is a very high, impoverished neighborhood just a stone's throw from the nation's capital. The major themes in these documents and in these speeches revolved around many important issues. One, and perhaps the ultimate major theme, was that we need to foster a comprehensive place-based approach to tackle the complexity of urban poverty and many barriers that make it so difficult to approach. And here in particular, he was talking about the Harlem Children's Zone, which was a comprehensive effort in New York City, a roughly 90-some square block area in Harlem, to undertake a kind of a comprehensive initiative combining education, housing, social policy, and the like. And he had said in his white paper that the first part of his plan to combat urban poverty will be to replicate the Harlem Children's Zone in 20 cities across the country. Other key themes were providing families the support they need to raise their children, helping people find work and make that work pay, bringing business back to our inner cities, and increasing access to safe, affordable housing. His urban prosperity campaign paper, the number one point on a plank of that was to create a White House Office of Urban Policy, to foster better coordination among federal departments, a more coherent strategy and policy for addressing issues in metropolitan areas, and an office that would have a director that would report directly to the president and coordinate all federal urban programs. Within a month of taking office, Obama issued an executive order that created a White House Office of Urban Policy. And while certainly that was a highly symbolic action suggesting a high-level focus on urban issues, it also became the focal point for articulating an emphasis on place-based initiatives that would guide the Obama administration's domestic and fiscal policies. An interagency coordinating team was created and worked with the Office of Management and Budget, issued a white paper to executive department heads and agencies to lift up ideas that would involve placing emphasis on federal programs that would have a well-focused place-based strategy. There were 3 key principles enunciated in that memo: that there needed to be clear, measurable, and carefully evaluated goals that should guide investment and regulation. There needs to be recognition that change comes from the community level, and often through partnership. Complex problems require flexible and integrated solutions. And thirdly, that the challenges of urban areas demand a regional approach. To date, promised neighborhoods, or at least the planning phase of that, are real. At the end of September, $10 million in planning grants were awarded to 21 recipients across the country. The 2011 budget includes $200 million for implementing promised neighborhoods in those communities. Sustainable Communities Initiative awards were recently announced as part of a $409 million package of grant awards that combined efforts of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, and the Environmental Protection Agency to promote planning, infrastructure, housing, and other place-based investments that shape physical development patterns. And the White House Office of Urban Affairs last month released a Neighborhood Revitalization Initiative framing paper that talks about these as not just separate initiatives, but things like promised neighborhoods, choice neighborhoods, which involves integration of Department of Education and Department of Housing and Urban Development work around public housing and schools, Department of Justice, community health centers, behavioral health centers, is kind of an overarching platform of how these various grant efforts will be carried out. The other part of the Obama urban policy is what folks at the Brookings Institution referred to as metropolitan policy by accident. And here they're talking about the stimulus package, the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act that was passed in February of 2009. One of the second key principles in Obama's campaign paper was to increase funding for the Community Development Block Grant Program, which is the major federal urban program, and ARA made that a reality. There were also significant dollars available for investment in transportation and other infrastructures that cities desperately needed. Surface transportation, including things like high-speed rail and not just highways, dollars and investments for promoting green building strategies and alternative energy approaches, funding to help cities deal with the foreclosure crisis, both directly to cities but also for homeowners. But at the core issue of much of the stimulus is that much of that money still goes through state governments. And as we know, state governments are not always responsive to cities. And indeed, a report last summer showed that of the transportation dollars through the Federal Highway Administration, of those projects that had been certified as of the end of June, about 48% of those dollars went to projects in the top 100 metropolitan areas of the country. Those metropolitan areas, however, comprise 63% of the nation's population and 73% of the GDP. So despite dollars that were made available to pursue various kinds of urban initiatives, those dollars were still being channeled through state governments that weren't always responsive to urban needs. So to conclude, let me offer you some reasons why I'm optimistic about urban policy and the Obama presidency. First and foremost, he understands the issues, probably understands the issues, as I said earlier, more clearly than others. Second, these issues have been somewhat elevated in importance, though they've certainly been overshadowed by the economy, with the establishment of the White House Office of Urban Affairs. There is a plan, and that plan is reasonably consistent with what we know to be best practices based on recent experience over the last decade through government and private sector funded initiatives. That notion of emphasis on place-based, collaboration, regionalism, and that steps towards implementation are already underway, as I noted with Promised Neighborhoods, the Sustainable Communities, and some of the other grants that are about to be awarded. Now the reasons to be pessimistic. Certainly, as you heard from the other panelists, and particularly from my colleague Ellen Abramowitz, the midterm elections are likely to be devastating for the prospects of full implementation. Many of the ideas that are embedded in the budget or legislative proposals are going to find a very difficult time working their way through Congress. And in part, that it has to do not only with what the new Congress is going to look like, it also has to do with the kind of political and policy rhetoric that's going to come out of that and that has characterized campaign cycles, not just now, but over the last several cycles. And that is some of the ways in which budget and tax issues constrain policy options. We are at historic lows in terms of the revenue-raising capacity of the federal government. As of most recent year for which we have hard numbers, 2009, federal revenues were 14.8% of GDP. The last time numbers were that low was 1950, when they were 14.4%. In 2006, when federal revenues were 20.6% of GDP, we had a budget surplus. But even at 20%, the United States still ranks third from the bottom of the 30 OECD countries in terms of the proportion of government revenues as a percent of GDP. So there's this perception that we have big government and that government is taking a huge bite out of the economy. But when you look at the revenue yield and compare that within our country historically, or look at it from a comparative perspective, we're actually a low-tax nation. But try putting that in the political mix in terms of raising revenues to be able to provide funding to address many of the important priorities that are before us. So money may not be forthcoming for implementation. The ARA-funded initiatives are going to stall out. That money was like a huge block grant for the Obama administration to help stimulate the economy, and it's going to be very difficult to get new initiatives through. But even in this rather pessimistic scenario that we're not likely to see new funding available for not just urban initiatives but domestic issues in general, I think there's still kind of a silver lining in this, in that through some of the interagency collaboration that's taking place right now and the ability to work with existing programs and try to align them more coherently, there still may be room to break through in more innovative ways of the federal government being a partner with cities and states and private and nonprofit sectors addressing urban issues that simply hasn't been on the table during the last 8 years of the Bush administration. So I'm guardedly optimistic, but that we'll be able to still address some of these issues, but I don't think we'll be able to do so in as ambitious a way as Obama outlined in his 2008 campaign. Thank you.